They found something in the ice that didn't belong to our time. Not alien, not Soviet. Something that broke the rules we didn't know existed. And the moment the satellite flagged it, three things became inevitable: the discovery, the choice, and the watchers who'd been waiting 40 years for someone to make the wrong decision. Dr. Ethan Reeves had perfected the art of making terrible first impressions. His doctoral defense had involved a surprise fire. His job interview at the Xenobotanical Institute ended with accidental food poisoning. And now, standing before the assembled nobility of the Veltron Empire, he was about to add diplomatic incident to his growing collection. The throne room stretched before him like a cathedral built by someone who thought intimidation was an architectural style. Every surface gleamed. Every angle suggested judgment. Even the air felt formal, as if breathing too loudly might constitute treason. Ethan shifted his weight, heard his shoe squeak against the polished floor, and immediately wished he could dissolve into his own molecular structure. In his hands, a slim environmental case hummed softly, maintaining precise conditions for the singular specimen inside. He'd spent 6 months coaxing it back from extinction, reconstructing its genome from fragmentary records, salvaged from a dead world's archives. It was, without question, the finest work of his career. It was also, apparently, about to cause an interstellar crisis. Dr. Ethan Reeves, the herald announced, voice echoing with ceremonial gravitas, here to present findings to Her Radiance, Empress Kaida. Ethan walked forward, each step feeling like voluntary surrender. He'd rehearsed this moment 17 times in his quarters. Every rehearsal had ended differently, but they all shared one common element. None of them involved whatever was about to happen. He stopped at the designated spot, marked by a subtle shift in the floor's luminescence, and executed what he hoped was an acceptable bow. His knee made an alarming clicking sound. He pretended not to notice. "Your Radiance," he began, and his voice came out steadier than expected. "Small victories. Thank you for granting me this audience. I promise I'm here for purely botanical reasons, which historically has been a safe assumption." Oh, few of the assembled courtiers exchanged glances. Ethan couldn't tell if they were amused or horrified, possibly both. "I've spent the better part of a year reconstructing something lost," he continued, finding his rhythm now. Science was comfortable territory, not for prestige or publication, but because some things deserve to exist again. He activated the case's release mechanism, transparent panels folded back with mechanical precision, revealing the contents within. The flower unfurled slowly, responding to the change in atmosphere. Its structure was delicate but confident, petals cycling through subtle color shifts as cellular processes remembered their purpose after centuries of dormancy. The court fell silent in a way that suggested actual attention rather than polite tolerance. Ethan didn't look at them. He looked at Empress Kaida. "It's called a star whisper," he said quietly. "At least, that's my best translation. The original world that cultivated them was destroyed in the Convergence Wars. This might be the only living specimen in the galaxy now." He lifted the case slightly, offering it forward. "I thought, given everything your people have funded, given the resources you've provided to restore what was lost, you should see it alive, before it cycles and fades." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Empress Kaida stood. The movement rippled through the court like electricity through water. Ethan's brain registered alarm signals but couldn't quite process what they meant. Had he violated some protocol? Was standing a prelude to execution? Why hadn't anyone given him clearer instructions? But the Empress was descending the dais steps, and there was no manual for this. She stopped directly before him, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns in her irises. Not quite human, not quite alien, something in between that evolution had decided worked well enough. Her gaze fixed on the flower. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, recognition, as if she'd been waiting to see something like this her entire life without knowing it. "It's completely safe," Ethan said quickly. "Non-toxic, non-reactive. I mean, I wouldn't recommend eating it, but that's true of most things I work with." "You grew this?" she said. Not a question. An observation weighted with significance he didn't fully understand. From genetic fragments, yes, took a lot of trial and error, and one catastrophic failure that we don't talk about. He offered a nervous smile. "But this one's stable. Perfect, even." That's when she embraced him. It happened faster than thought. Arms around his shoulders, warm and solid and absolutely real. Ethan's mind shut down every non-essential function. The case tilted dangerously in his grip. Somewhere behind him, someone made a sound like a small animal discovering existential dread. Before he could recalibrate his understanding of reality, she kissed his cheek. The sound echoed, soft, deliberate, impossibly loud. Ethan stood completely still, every muscle locked, thoughts racing like panicked laboratory mice. He was aware of several things simultaneously: the faint scent of the flower, the lingering warmth where her lips had touched, and the weaponized silence of every single person in the room. He began, then stopped, because every possible sentence felt catastrophically wrong. Empress Kaida stepped back, and her smile was unlike anything Ethan had seen in official recordings. It wasn't diplomatic, it wasn't carefully measured, it was genuine, the kind of expression people wore when they forgot they were being watched. "You honor me, Dr. Reeves," she said, voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Ethan nodded very carefully. "You're welcome." Behind him, someone dropped something. The crash was inappropriately loud, perfectly timed, and somehow made everything worse. Ethan wondered distantly whether flowers could photosynthesize political awkwardness, and whether it was too late to request immediate evacuation to another galaxy. Three things became clear in rapid succession. First, silence could be weaponized with surgical precision. Second, being escorted by palace guards didn't automatically mean imprisonment, but it felt uncomfortably similar. Third, no amount of botanical training prepared you for accidentally triggering a cultural crisis with good intentions. The guards guided him, politely but firmly, through corridors that seemed to adjust their ambient lighting based on collective stress levels. Currently, they glowed a shade. Ethan's panicked brain labeled as diplomatic mauve. "Am I in trouble?" he asked the nearest guard. "You are secure," the guard replied, which was absolutely not the same as no. They deposited him in a reception chamber that seemed to generate furniture on demand. A table emerged offering a cup of something steaming and fragrant. Ethan eyed it suspiciously. "Is this going to make me forget the last hour?" The cup pulsed gently, which he interpreted as no comment. He sat, waited, replayed the moment over and over with the enthusiasm of someone whose brain had decided self-torture was a productive hobby. The embrace, the kiss, the collective gasp that suggested history had just tripped over its own shoelaces and face-planted into chaos. Minutes passed with the speed of geological processes. Then the door opened and Empress Kaida entered without fanfare. Ethan stood too quickly, nearly knocking over the mysterious beverage. "Hi, hello, Your Radiance. I should probably apologize, except I'm not entirely sure what I did." She studied him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. "You're unsettled." "That's my baseline state, yes, but today I've earned it." Her mouth curved slightly. She gestured for him to sit, and he obeyed, with the relief of someone grateful for clear instructions. "You didn't know," she said. "I absolutely didn't know," Ethan confirmed immediately. "If I had known, I would have brought a card. Or nothing. Probably nothing. Nothing would have been safer." She exhaled slowly, something between a sigh and a laugh. "Among my people, to cultivate life with your own hands and present it directly is an intimate declaration. It speaks of investment, care, intention." Ethan felt his stomach drop several floors. "On my world, it usually means I panicked and needed something to hold on to." That surprised a genuine laugh from her, brief, unguarded. "And yet you chose that particular bloom, something rare, fleeting, requiring devotion." "I chose it because you funded the project and deserved to see the results," Ethan said. "Also because formal reports seemed insufficient and possibly boring." "They are," she agreed. Then, more quietly, "The court will interpret my response as reciprocation." "Of romantic interest," Ethan said faintly. "Of acknowledgement." He stared into his probably tea. "I swear my intention was gratitude mixed with scientific enthusiasm." Silence settled between them, less sharp now, more contemplative. "And yet," Kata said, "you chose to give me something alive, something that required your continuous effort, your attention, your care." Ethan frowned. "I didn't want to hand you a data file. Those are terrible gifts." "No," she agreed. "They are." They sat with that for a moment. "I don't want to cause harm," Ethan said finally. "I know." She stood. "The council is already debating whether you should be protected, honored, or exiled." "The full spectrum, then?" "They're thorough." She moved toward the door, paused. "You may return to your quarters. For now." "For now," he echoed, latching onto the temporary nature of that statement. As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "For what it's worth, the flower responded unusually well to your presence, better than laboratory conditions would predict." Her expression softened. "So did I." She left him alone with that admission, and Ethan stood there wondering whether botany had just become the most dangerous science in the galaxy. Sleep was theoretical. Ethan lay in his assigned quarters, staring at a ceiling that cycled through calming celestial patterns designed by someone who'd clearly never experienced acute political panic. The stars drifted. He counted them, then named them after extinct plant species. That helped for approximately 30 seconds. His communicator chimed, then chimed again. Messages from colleagues who thought this was hilarious, from administrators who definitely didn't, from one particularly unhelpful friend asking whether flowers now qualified as controlled substances. Ethan rolled over and pressed his face into the pillow. "I just wanted to say thank you," he muttered into the fabric. The door chimed. He froze. It chimed again, patient and insistent. Ethan sat up, ran both hands through his hair, and activated the door before he could talk himself out of it. Empress Kaida stood in the corridor. No crown, no guards. Just her, looking oddly uncertain in a way that made her seem more human and somehow more alien simultaneously. "I'm not hallucinating," Ethan said immediately. "I hope not," she replied. "That would make this conversation awkward." "As opposed to the current level of awkwardness." "Fair point." She stepped inside, the door sealing behind her with a soft hiss that felt entirely too final. "I didn't bring flowers," Ethan said, deliberately for obvious reasons. "I noticed." She glanced around the room, taking in the organized chaos of his temporary living space. "May I sit?" "Please, yes, anywhere." The furniture's sentient, Probably. She sat at the edge of a chair like someone unused to relaxing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The council believes you're either brilliant or foolish, Kaida said finally. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, she agreed. They're debating whether your gesture was calculated or accidental. It was calculated, Ethan said. I just didn't calculate correctly, which feels worse somehow. Her mouth twitched. Ignorance with good intentions is still integrity. He sighed. We have entire academic disciplines dedicated to misunderstanding context. She studied him closely now, not as an empress evaluating a subject, but as a person trying to solve a puzzle. You're not seeking advantage. If I were seeking advantage, I would have actually read the cultural briefing instead of using it as a coaster. That earned another laugh, real and unguarded. Her posture relaxed incrementally. I've spent my life ensuring every gesture is controlled, she said. Measured, analyzed before execution. How's that working out? She considered him, then smiled ruefully, exhaustingly. Something eased in the space between them. I didn't come to demand anything, Kaida continued, or to apologize. Good, Ethan said. I'm terrible at receiving apologies, never know what to do with my hands. A pause, then she smiled. Again, more genuine each time. I came because the court is transforming this into something premature, and because I wanted to see if the man who resurrects extinct species panics in private as much as in public. Ethan thought about lying, decided honesty was simpler. Oh, significantly more. In public, I'm at least wearing shoes. Her eyes crinkled with amusement. Tell me something, she said. If you don't want a complication, what do you want? Ethan leaned back, considering. Honestly, to keep doing my work, to not accidentally destabilize governments, to maybe understand what just happened. And if understanding takes time, I'm patient, he said. Plants taught me that. Things grow at their own pace. She nodded slowly. Then let us agree to something. I'm excellent at agreeing. We won't define this, Kaida said. Not yet. Not until we understand what it actually is. Ethan felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying start to dissolve. Undefined is manageable. I work with unknown variables constantly. She stood, moved toward the door, paused without turning. The star whisper hasn't closed yet. Its bloom cycle has extended. Ethan blinked. That's not possible. The genetic encoding is specific. It responds to presence, she said, to attention. She glanced back at him. Perhaps it knows something we don't. The door opened. Ethan, she added, next time you wish to thank me, consider using words first. She left him alone with artificial stars and the uncomfortable realization that some things, once started, developed their own momentum regardless of intention. By morning, the palace had developed collective opinions. Ethan knew this because his communicator had stopped vibrating and started generating its own gravity field from the sheer mass of incoming messages. Scientists wanted clarification. Administrators wanted statements. One intern asked whether botanical gifts now required security clearance. Ethan ignored everything and focused on the immediate crisis. Breakfast. The food synthesizer had apparently learned his preferences overnight and was now aggressively suggesting nutrition-optimized options that tasted like nutritional spite. He selected something labeled grain adjacent and discovered the table was displaying a live council session without his consent. I didn't agree to this, he told the table. The table disagreed silently. The Queen's advisors were debating in perfectly measured tones that somehow made everything sound more ominous. Words like precedent, Symbolic implications and interspecies protocols drifted past. Ethan ate mechanically and wondered if anyone would notice if he relocated to an uninhabited asteroid. His communicator chimed. A new message. Requested presence, Botanical District, Section 7, non-negotiable. Ethan stared at it. They usually negotiate first. Section 7 was his domain, a sprawling biodome allocated for his research. Adaptive climate zones, soil, imported from 3 worlds that had never previously agreed on anything except Dirt's existence. Ethan felt calmer immediately upon entering. The air smelled alive. The plants didn't care about court politics. They responded to light, water, attention, reasonable expectations. Empress Kaida was already there, standing among the growth chambers without attendants, sleeves rolled back slightly, examining a climbing vine with focused curiosity. That one's friendly, Ethan said automatically. Mostly. She glanced at him. Mostly isn't reassuring. It only restricts if it perceives threat, he explained, or exceptional gravitational anomalies. How does it decide? Chemistry, instinct, poor judgment occasionally? She smiled and gently redirected the vine back to its support structure. You summoned me here. I was summoned, Ethan corrected, which is different and significantly more stressful. Then we're both here involuntarily, she said. That's the foundation of most productive partnerships. They walked between rows of specimens, silence settling comfortably now. Ethan adjusted environmental controls out of habit more than necessity. The council believes this space is neutral, Kaida said. They're less inclined to argue surrounded by chlorophyll. Plants have excellent diplomatic properties, Ethan agreed. She stopped near the star whisper, still impossibly open, petals luminous, defying its own biology. They want to know your intentions, Kaida said quietly. Ethan laughed, short, incredulous. Intentions? I barely know what I'm having for lunch. This isn't humorous to them. I know, he said. That's why I'm joking. She turned to face him. Do you regret the gesture? He thought about it, about the warmth of her embrace, about the way the court had frozen, about the way something inside him had settled when she laughed in his quarters, unexpected, but not unwelcome. No, he said. I regret being uninformed, not the act itself. Kaida nodded slowly. That answer will complicate matters. I seem to excel at that. A display activated at the dome's edge. Proposals from the council, each worse than the last. Formal inquiry, cultural mediation, temporary separation, permanent reassignment, exile. Exile feels extreme, Ethan observed. They're being cautious, Kaida said. Of what? A botanist with terrible timing. Of change. Ethan sighed. I can leave, if that makes this easier. Her expression sharpened. Don't offer sacrifices you don't wish to make. I wish to make very few sacrifices, he admitted. Mostly I wish to grow things and not destabilize interstellar relations. Kaida studied him, then dismissed the projection with a gesture. I'll address the council, but I won't erase what happened. That's bold. I'm tired of restraint, she replied. And you, Dr. Reeves, have disrupted my equilibrium with soil and sincerity. Those are my core competencies. She stepped closer to the star whisper, reaching toward it without touching. It responds to you. It responds to attention, Ethan said. Same as most living things. She looked at him then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Understanding neither had intended to cultivate but couldn't deny was growing. Stay, she said simply. Ethan swallowed. I don't know what staying means. Neither do I, Kaida admitted. That makes it honest. He nodded, slow, deliberate. Then I'll stay. Somewhere in the palace an advisor would faint. In the greenhouse the star whisper pulsed brighter, as if approving the decision. Ethan wondered if this was how new ecosystems began. Quietly, unexpectedly, with two elements choosing proximity over certainty. The palace reacted to Ethan's decision the way complex systems always did when variables refused to resolve, with cascading side effects. By midday, he'd been invited to 3 committees, uninvited from one and formally observed by cultural liaisons who insisted they were invisible while standing directly in his sightline. Ethan waved at them once. They pretended not to notice. He retreated to the biodome under the pretense of recalibrating growth cycles, which wasn't entirely untrue. Several specimens had begun showing accelerated responses when Empress Kaida was nearby. Ethan tried not to read into that, failed immediately. He was knee-deep in soil. Literally, one bed had aggressive suction properties. When his communicator chimed again, the header read, "Public Perception Briefing." "No," Ethan told the dirt firmly. The dirt, mercifully, didn't argue. Later, Kaida joined him again, this time with an aide who looked like they hadn't slept since the incident. "You're trending," the aide said flatly. Ethan blinked. "I'm a botanist." "Your name is now a cultural touchstone," the aide replied, "and a debate topic." Kaida dismissed them with a gesture. The aide left, clearly torn between relief and terror. "I apologize," Kaida said. "My people are expressive." "I once witnessed a university collapse over disputed fungus classification," Ethan said. "I understand passionate disagreement." They walked together, careful not to touch. A shared restraint that felt intentional now rather than awkward. "The council wants to know if you'll formalize anything," Kaida said. Ethan groaned. "Formalize what?" "Mutual confusion, an acknowledgement, a denial, something definable." He stopped walking. "What do you want?" She hesitated, and that alone felt monumental. "I want space to discover whether my reaction was cultural reflex or personal truth." Ethan nodded. "That seems reasonable." "They'll hate that." "Excellent, we're aligned." They shared a quiet moment before a plant behind them emitted a loud, rhythmic clicking. Kaida startled. "Well, what is that?" Ethan winced. "Pollinator beacon activates when it detects unresolved tension." "You're joking." "I wish I were." She laughed despite herself, the sound echoing softly against the biodome's curved surface. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. That evening, the palace broadcast a carefully worded statement about ongoing cultural exchange and mutual respect. Ethan watched from his quarters seated on the bed, eating something that might once have been bread. The message ended. Silence followed. Then his communicator chimed. "Private channel." "Kaida, are you awake?" "Ethan, define awake." "Kaida, I cannot sleep." "Ethan, that makes 2 of us. Mine's from anxiety. What's yours?" A pause. "Kaida, curiosity." He smiled before he could stop himself. She arrived without guards this time. No crown, no ceremony, just Kaida, standing in his doorway like someone uncertain whether casual existence was permitted. "I brought nothing," she said. "Good," Ethan replied. "I'm out of vases anyway." They sat on opposite sides of the room initially. Conversation wandered, her childhood education, his disastrous first off-world assignment, the strange comfort of shared ignorance. "At court," she said quietly, "every word is calculated before speaking." "I once offended a dignitary by complimenting their ceremonial attire," Ethan said. "Turns out it was funeral garb." She shook her head, amused. "With you, I don't feel observed." That's because I'm terrible at observation, he said. I get distracted easily. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was anticipatory. I'm afraid, Kata admitted. Me too, Ethan said immediately. But I'm afraid of very specific things, like expectations and formal dinners. And I'm afraid of choosing something for myself, she said, rather than for Judy. They sat there, fear acknowledged but not resolved. Outside, the palace hummed, systems adjusting, narratives forming. Inside, two people remained undefined, and for the first time, neither felt compelled to fix it. Ethan thought distantly that if this was how relationships evolved, slowly, awkwardly, with humor and hesitation, then perhaps the galaxy had been approaching connection incorrectly all along. By the 6th day after the flower, the palace stopped pretending this was temporary. Ethan noticed because guards no longer pretended not to know his name. One even asked whether the vine in Section 7 could be trained to climb walls without consuming them. Yes, Ethan said, but only if it respects the wall. The guard nodded, as if that answered everything. Kaida began appearing in unexpected places, not officially, not announced. She showed up in maintenance corridors, observation decks, once in a service lift that stalled halfway between levels, forcing them into 10 minutes of shared silence and surprisingly philosophical conversation about buttons. I pressed the wrong one, Ethan said. There are no wrong ones, Kata replied, then frowned. That sounded more profound in my head. The council escalated predictably. A formal inquiry was scheduled, not a trial, everyone insisted, but adjacent enough to make Ethan's stomach perform. Complicated gymnastics. He sat across from Kaida in a quiet chamber while aides debated optimal seating distances and appropriate eye contact angles. Apparently, Ethan whispered, there's a recommended number of centimeters for neutrality. Kaida leaned slightly closer. We're exceeding it. Recklessly, he agreed. When the inquiry began, it was less hostile than expected and more absurd. Cultural analysts projected diagrams. Behavioral specialists argued over subtle gestures. Someone presented a graph correlating Ethan's proximity with increased bloom longevity. That's circumstantial, Ethan muttered. Kaida's eyes crinkled. It's accurate. The questions came. Intent, meaning, consequence. Ethan answered honestly, which confused them most. I didn't plan this, he said, but I'm not pretending it didn't matter. Kaida spoke after him, voice steady but carrying new firmness. I won't punish curiosity, she said, nor will I reduce a genuine interaction to a violation. Silence followed, not weaponized but thoughtful. The inquiry ended without resolution, which everyone agreed was unprecedented. That evening, Kaida suggested they leave the palace. Leave? Ethan echoed. Like exit. There's a station beyond the upper ring, she said. Old, quiet, no one watches there. Ethan considered it. Is this how abdications start? She smiled. Only temporarily. They traveled in a small transit craft that recognized Kaida's biometrics and immediately adjusted its entire atmospheric composition accordingly. Even the ship knows who you are, Ethan observed. It doesn't know who I wish to be, she replied. The station was dimmer than the palace, older, its systems humming with tired patience. They walked along a viewport overlooking the planet's curve, stars steady and indifferent. I never come here, Kaida said. That seems criminal, Ethan replied. It has excellent silence. They stood there for a while, no politics, no flowers, just space. Do you ever regret choosing this life? Ethan asked. She didn't answer immediately. I regret not choosing it sooner. He nodded. I regret choosing mine too late. She turned to him. Ethan, if this ended tomorrow, would you regret staying? He smiled faintly. I regret very few things I cultivate. Her expression softened. They returned before anyone noticed they were gone. The palace resumed its rhythm. The council prepared statements that would never be used. That night, Ethan's communicator chimed once more. Kaida, tomorrow the council will demand clarity. Ethan, that sounds ominous. Kaida, I'm prepared to give them some. A pause. Ethan, should I be afraid? Kaida, only if you prefer certainty. He set the communicator aside and stared at the ceiling, which had finally learned to stay still. Whatever came next wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't fit neatly into protocol or taxonomy, but it would be chosen. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The council chamber felt different this time. Ethan sat where directed, hands folded, spine straight, heart doing experimental arrhythmia. Around him, advisors gathered with the careful patience of people who believed history might misbehave if they blinked. Empress Kaida entered last. No crown, no fanfare, just her. That alone derailed half the prepared statements. When Ethan finally looked at her, she met his eyes without hesitation, certain in a way that made his chest tighten. The first counselor cleared their throat. We require resolution. The events following the botanical presentation have created instability. Ethan opened his mouth. Kaida raised a hand. I'll speak, she said. Silence listened. What occurred was not a breach, Kaida continued, nor manipulation. It was an interaction unshielded by protocol. A ripple passed through the chamber. I won't deny its significance, she said, nor exaggerate it to satisfy fear. Ethan felt tension dissolve. This court has governed through caution for centuries, Kaida said, and caution has kept us stable. It has also kept us isolated. Someone objected softly. Kaida didn't look at them. The human botanist didn't seek influence, she said. He sought expression. I responded as myself, not as office. Ethan swallowed. Therefore, Kaida said, there will be no exile, no forced bond, no retraction. There will be acknowledgement of choice. The room stilled. And your association? One counselor asked carefully. Kaida turned to Ethan. For that, I'll let him answer. Every eye found him. Ethan inhaled deeply. I came here to grow things, he said. I still intend to. A few counselors blinked. I don't know what this should become, he continued, but I know what it isn't. It isn't a mistake, and it isn't a threat. A pause. Then, because honesty had gotten him this far, it's also the least efficient way I've ever destabilized a system, and I once rerouted an entire watershed through a broken filtration unit. A few startled sounds emerged. One might have been a laugh. I'm staying, Ethan said, as a botanist, as a person, not as a symbol. Kaida inclined her head. The council deliberated quietly, rapidly. When they spoke again, it was with reluctant acceptance. The court recognizes the Empress's authority, they said, and the uniqueness of this situation. Ethan resisted the urge to cheer. Afterward, the palace didn't collapse. No wars erupted. No traditions spontaneously combusted. What happened was subtler and somehow more disruptive. People relaxed. Not all at once, but enough. Ethan returned to full-time research, officially expanding into a joint initiative. Students arrived, scholars followed. Someone asked him to give a lecture titled Emotional Resonance in Non-Sentient Flora, which he immediately renamed Why This Plant Likes You. Kaida visited often, sometimes formally, sometimes not. Sometimes they discussed governance and culture. Sometimes they argued about soil composition. Once they spent an hour watching a seed pod respond to sound. Does it always do that? Kaida asked. No, Ethan said. Only when it feels attended to. She smiled. They didn't rush. The court waited for escalation that never came. No declarations, no scandals. What grew instead was quieter, shared rhythm, cultivated trust. Ethan noticed the change gradually. He stopped apologizing before speaking. He stopped assuming his presence was accidental. He learned that offering something meaningful didn't require certainty, only care. One evening, long after excitement had cooled into memory, they stood together in the biodome as the original Star Whisper finally closed, its cycle complete. Kaida touched the containment field gently. It lasted longer than expected. So did I, Ethan said. She turned to him. You no longer seem afraid. I am, he admitted, just not of this. She leaned in, close enough that the space between them felt intentional, rather than charged. Then, Kaida said softly, thank you. For the flowers. Ethan smiled. Next time I'll explain first. She laughed, and the sound carried through the greenhouse, setting half the plants humming in quiet response. Somewhere systems adjusted, cultures shifted. Nothing broke. And in a palace once ruled entirely by restraint, something new had taken root. Not loud, not dramatic, but alive, and growing exactly where it had chosen to be.